In The Rational Optimist, science writer and journalist Matt Ridley writes that the human capacity for innovation, through the spread, exchange, and blending of ideas, has been the main driver of humankind's progress and prosperity. This penchant for innovation, unique to humans, has driven the advances in technology, culture, and political organization that have made today's society healthier, wealthier, and safer than any in human history. Ridley writes that such a cross-pollination of ideas would have been impossible without free trade and the exchange of goods. He says trade is more than just an act of physical exchange, it's a carrier of ideas. When goods move from one place to another, they bring with them the knowledge of their creation and use. When we trade goods, we create networks of knowledge that reach beyond local communities and nations, allowing innovators to build upon each other's work. Ridley's interpretation of this historical evidence, that when ideas and goods flow freely, human societies flourish, guides his optimistic vision for the future, one that's more open, vibrant, connected, and resilient. In this guide, we'll go through Ridley's exploration of the past, present, and future of human prosperity, looking at how the exchange of ideas and knowledge has fostered human prosperity, and how free trade has been the chief mechanism of this exchange. How trade promotes stable and cooperative societies by promoting trust and political freedom. How our capacity for innovation provides a case for optimism on climate change. Why free trade is better than foreign aid for promoting growth and prosperity in developing countries. Throughout this guide, we'll supplement and compare Ridley's ideas with insights from other writers and thinkers who've explored the benefits of trade and free markets, the relationship between capitalism and democracy, and more. Critical reaction to The Rational Optimist. The Rational Optimist drew a range of responses from critics and publications upon its release in 2010. While celebrating Ridley's optimistic take on the future, the Wall Street Journal noted that Ridley's stance in favor of minimal regulation of corporations might not sit well with all readers. The review cited Ridley's dismissal of climate change and his skepticism of increased regulation of business as stances that would likely polarize readers. The New York Times was positive about the book's extensive and detailed history of trade, but criticized Ridley for making unsupported leaps in his arguments about the market's power. Specifically, the review argued that Ridley overstated the power of trade and improperly cast it as the impetus behind all of humanity's advances. The review also noted that Ridley glided over the fact that the sharing of physical goods and the sharing of ideas often happen independently, thus calling into question his thesis of trade as the primary mechanism for the exchange of ideas. A review in The Guardian appreciated Ridley's success in tracing the impact of trade from early hunter-gatherers to the present, praising Ridley's thesis as a compelling explanation for human advancement. However, the review also pointed out weaknesses in Ridley's arguments, particularly his rationale for his blanket distrust of government. The publication found Ridley's anti-government stance reductive, dogmatic, and unsupported by evidence. Part 1. The Power of Human Knowledge Sharing. Ridley writes that humans' distinguishing characteristic is our penchant for exchanging and accumulating knowledge. We don't merely hoard knowledge. We share, combine, and build upon it. Ridley writes that what makes us distinct as a species is our shared intelligence, a body of wisdom that grows and evolves as we pass it along. In this section, we'll explore this idea in depth, explaining how cultural evolution enables our ideas to build on one another, how trade has been the primary mechanism for this cross-pollination of ideas by enabling individuals and groups to develop specialized skills. Is human knowledge sharing unique? While recent research supports Ridley's argument about humans' distinctive ability to exchange and accumulate knowledge, there's growing evidence that other animals show a surprising ability to attain and pass on knowledge. According to research into the cooperative behavior of bees and chimps, these animals show remarkable skills in collective problem-solving and knowledge transmission within their communities. Bees, through their complex dance language, can communicate intricate details about the location of food sources, while chimps use tools and exhibit behaviors that other chimps learn through observation and mimicry. However, these knowledge exchanges ultimately pale in comparison to the human practice of sharing, combining, and building upon information on a vast scale. Unlike bees and chimps, whose knowledge and skills are relatively static and tied closely to survival, Human knowledge is dynamic, driving progress in arts, sciences, technologies, and social structures, underscoring Ridley's point that humans take this to an unprecedented level. Cultural evolution enables our ideas to build on one another. Ridley defines cultural evolution as the process of ideas interacting, cross-pollinating, and, most importantly, improving. Cultural evolution occurs when people in a society exchange and modify their ideas, beliefs, and technologies with those of people from other societies. Over time, ideas evolve, blend, contrast, and build upon each other. And, writes Ridley, this interplay of ideas generates solutions that are stronger and more advanced than their original forms, delivering an abundance of material resources, cultural achievements, and new levels of human health and happiness. For example, around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia developed irrigation techniques that enabled them to cultivate crops year-round in the fertile but arid region. As trade routes expanded, they exchanged wheat and barley for crops like dates and sesame from neighboring regions. They also exchanged knowledge about water management and crop rotation. This knowledge improved agricultural practices and increased food production, which directly improved the health and longevity of the population. Criticisms of the concept of cultural evolution. While Ridley points to cultural evolution as the foundation of shared human knowledge and progress, scholars have offered several criticisms of it as a concept. Some note that cultural evolution theories have a deterministic undertone, implying that cultures evolve in a linear, progressive manner. Critics argue that this perspective oversimplifies the nature of cultural change, noting that it's an inherently complex and unpredictable process. Other scholars note that the term cultural evolution itself is problematic because of its association with colonialist and ethnocentric biases that placed Western societies at the pinnacle of cultural development, toward which other cultures needed to evolve. Additionally, some experts point out that cultural evolution theories don't adequately account for the role of human agency. They note that such theories emphasize structural factors, overarching forces or patterns like economic systems and political institutions, while downplaying the role of charismatic individuals, grassroots initiatives, and artistic and intellectual leaders in shaping culture. Trade facilitates cultural evolution. Ridley writes that trade and exchange are the key facilitators of cultural evolution. Through trade, humans open the door for ideas to spread, mix, and evolve beyond geographical and cultural boundaries. According to Ridley, before societies began trading, each group had to be self-sufficient, producing or procuring everything they required independently. This not only limited their resources but also confined their ideas and knowledge within their physical boundaries. When trade networks emerged, however, people could exchange goods, ideas, and practices between diverse cultures and regions. The limitations of autarky. Why economic self-reliance falls short. Ridley notes the limitations of pre-trading societies, observing that the need to produce everything independently made such societies materially, culturally, and intellectually poorer. The experience of some modern countries that have lived under autarky, complete economic self-reliance, underscores Ridley's argument about the primacy of trade in human growth and advancement. For example, North Korea has long operated under an autarkic economic model, arising from a combination of imposed self-reliance and sanctions imposed by other nations. This has resulted in economic stagnation, widespread poverty, and severe food insecurity. Trade leads to specialization. In addition to cultural evolution, Ridley emphasizes another key benefit of trade: specialization. According to Ridley, when societies engage in trade, individuals can specialize in activities where they have a competitive advantage. Before trade, every individual or community needed to master all skills necessary for survival. This approach wasn't efficient, writes Ridley, because it dissipated the efforts and time of each individual and community across a wide array of tasks, each requiring a different skill set. For example, before trade, a single community might have needed to cultivate crops, hunt, weave clothing, and construct shelters. According to Ridley, the dawn of trade ushered in a dramatic change. If one community was adept at farming and another excelled at tool-making, they could each specialize in these tasks and trade their surplus with each other. Specialization and affordability. Specialization among early trading communities led to increased efficiency and competitive advantage for those communities. However, in a more modern context, some economists note that specialization in an industry can make certain regions unaffordable for those not employed in that industry. In San Francisco, the city's specialization in tech has led to an influx of highly paid tech workers to the city. These tech workers, who earn more than double the median U.S. wage, are able to pay much higher prices for housing, driving up living costs all across the city. This leaves non-tech workers, who earn less on average than their tech-employed neighbors, increasingly unable to afford San Francisco. The benefits of specialization. Ridley writes that specialization brought meaningful benefits by 1. Improving the quality and quantity of goods available, and 2. Creating an opportunity for people to innovate and advance within their chosen specialties. Specialization improved the quality and quantity of goods available by boosting efficiency. When individuals began to focus on tasks that matched their skills, they produced more than when they divided their attention across all aspects of survival. Moreover, it created opportunities for people to deepen their skills in a chosen field by giving them greater freedom to think, experiment, and refine their craft. This led to enhanced techniques, tools, and products over time. And with this output of new and better goods, specialization accelerated the trade boom by creating bigger surpluses for communities to trade with their neighbors. This trade enabled further specialization, which led to even more trade, as part of a continuous and virtuous circle. Short-form note: although regional economic specialization can drive innovation and spur experimentation, it can also make communities vulnerable to disruptions in trade. Throughout the 20th century, Detroit's economy heavily depended on the auto industry. However, Detroit's status as a one-industry town set the stage for economic crisis when the U.S. economy shifted away from manufacturing and the domestic auto industry struggled to compete with foreign automakers. At the same time, the auto industry began moving factories and jobs out of Detroit to suburban, rural, and even international locations to reduce costs. As a result, Detroit saw massive job losses, significant population decline, and sharply reduced tax revenues. Trade leads to agriculture and civilization. Trade, according to Ridley, provided the impetus for agriculture, and agriculture became the cornerstone of settled civilization. Here's how it happened. Before agriculture took root, humans were largely hunters and gatherers. This lifestyle didn't require them to stay in a fixed place. But trading required a meeting place and often benefited from proximity to other communities and stability. Thus, humans began to live in larger, long-term communities near trading spots, the beginnings of cities and settled civilization. Short-form note: there is some evidence that some hunter-gatherer societies actually did live in settled communities before the adoption of agriculture. Sites such as those of the Natufian culture in the Levant, dating back to around 12,000 to 9,500 BCE, feature evidence of villages occupied year-round, suggesting a more rooted and sedentary lifestyle. Moreover, historical evidence suggests that engaging in trade doesn't require a group to be sedentary. For example, Mongolian nomads were pivotal in facilitating trade across vast distances on the Silk Roads, trading routes that connected ancient China with Europe, leveraging their mobility to connect distant civilizations. Moreover, writes Ridley, these burgeoning communities required a steady food supply. Hunting and gathering was unpredictable and unable to meet the growing demand. This problem spurred our ancestors to develop agriculture. They discovered that they could grow plants and breed animals on a large scale. The steady, localized food supply created by farming was ideal for supporting the consistently populated trading communities. This became a positive feedback loop as farming, in turn, accelerated trade. Once people began to grow crops or rear livestock, they produced more food than they could consume. The surplus could then be traded for other necessities and luxuries. This led not only to the growth of these early communities but also to increased specialization, as people began to focus more on producing specific goods for trade. Did agriculture increase the food supply? Some scholars have pushed back against the idea that agriculture actually increased the food supply for early societies. In Against the Grain, political scientist and anthropologist James C. Scott posits that the move to sedentary agricultural societies introduced challenges that were absent in hunter-gatherer societies. He writes that the reliance on fixed agriculture didn't universally enhance human prosperity. Instead, it imposed a more labor-intensive, less diverse diet on populations compared to the varied and often abundant diets of hunter-gatherers. Further, he writes that the transition to agriculture, which often meant growing a single type of grain, such as wheat or corn, often led to nutritional deficiencies and increased vulnerability to crop failures. Reliance on monocrop farming thus made early agricultural societies susceptible to disease and famine, in contrast to the more resilient and varied diets of hunter-gatherers. Scott highlights that hunter-gatherer societies had certain advantages over farming societies, such as mobility, which allowed for a more flexible response to environmental changes and resource availability. Part 2. Trade promotes stable, open, and cooperative societies. In the last section, we explored Ridley's primary argument that trade, and the resulting exchange of ideas, has been the main driver of human growth, advancement, and prosperity. In this section, we'll look at how trade fosters a stable, open, and cooperative society based on transparency, accountability, and respectful interaction between individuals and groups. In particular, we'll explore how trade promotes trust, cooperation, and goodwill among strangers. How trade strengthens free political systems. Trade promotes trust. Ridley writes that free exchange isn't just an economic activity. It's a potent force that promotes trust, cooperation, and goodwill among humans, contributing to social cohesion and harmony. According to Ridley, exchange and trade create trust and boost relationships, even among strangers. This is because trade thrives on fairness, mutual benefit, and repeat transactions. If you're consistently dishonest in your exchanges, word will spread, and other traders will avoid dealing with you. That works against your self-interest as your opportunities for trade, and the benefits it brings, dry up. Thus, the self-interest of profit and advantage in trade naturally encourages trading partners to be truthful and respectful with one another. Moreover, the necessity to forge new partnerships calls for you to expand your good reputation outside immediate kin and into an extensive network. The McDonald's Peace Theory. Other scholars and writers have explored the idea that free trade acts as a powerful cohesive force between societies. Author Thomas Friedman is a proponent of what he terms the McDonald's Peace Theory, noting that no two countries with McDonald's franchises have ever gone to war with each other. This theory, first put forward by Friedman in his 1999 book The Lexus and the Olive Tree, illustrates a broader point about economic interdependence. Countries that are closely integrated into the global economy, evident by them having McDonald's franchises, are less likely to engage in conflict with one another because war would disrupt their economic stability and growth. However, recent events have cast some doubt on the theory. Observers point to the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh region, despite both nations having McDonald's outlets. The conflict demonstrates that commercial interdependence may not always translate to real political stability. In addition, theories like the McDonald's Peace Theory may oversimplify the complexities of international relations, which are deeply influenced by culture, history, and politics. Trade promotes political freedom. Ridley posits that the trust and mutual respect that trade promotes also bolsters political freedom. Through trade, people see the mutual benefits of cooperation over conflict, which can translate into a greater willingness to resolve political or social conflicts through dialogue and compromise rather than coercion or violence. These are cornerstone values in democratic societies. Short-form note. Some writers disagree with Ridley, arguing democracy and capitalism aren't inherently linked. They note that capitalist economies can function under many different systems of government, from open and liberal democracies to full-fledged autocratic states. Moreover, some of the excesses and problems of capitalism can delegitimize democratic states when they fail to effectively address these issues. When unchecked capitalism leads to severe income inequality, concentrated corporate power, insufficient social welfare, and environmental degradation, democratic governments that can't mitigate these issues risk seeing their citizens lose faith in the democratic system's ability to ensure fairness and equitable opportunity. Ridley also writes that in a thriving open economic system, wealth, and thus economic power, is typically more dispersed, leading to a diffusion of political power. For example, in a market town where multiple small businesses flourish, wealth is distributed among many entrepreneurs and workers rather than concentrated in the hands of a few. This broad-based economic empowerment translates into a more democratic distribution of political power, with a larger proportion of the population having the means and incentive to participate actively in local governance and decision-making processes. Short-form note. In Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman says that capitalism's decentralized structure helps explain its connection to political freedom. According to Friedman, the uncoordinated and voluntary transactions of ordinary people are the linchpin of a well-functioning capitalist system. Millions of individual buyers and sellers make decisions about which goods and services they require to satisfy their needs. He writes that this economic freedom acts as an important check against the power of political authorities because it represents a sphere of life that's not controlled by the government. Part 3. We shouldn't rush toward a green energy transition. Now that we understand why free trade has been a powerful driver of human progress throughout history, we'll explore Ridley's response to one of the main challenges facing humanity: climate change. He urges caution and restraint in response to climate change, arguing that we should fully consider the risks of reacting too hastily or zealously in our efforts to mitigate the effects of a warming planet. In this section, we'll explore the core of Ridley's argument against an overreaction to climate change, looking at how fossil fuels have played an indispensable role in driving humanity's prosperity, and why we'll continue to rely on them to propel global economic growth. The high costs and potential negative consequences associated with a transition to green energy. The capacity of innovation and technology to address the consequences of climate change. In defense of fossil fuels, Ridley writes that fossil fuels have played a key part in propelling human prosperity, particularly since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. He asserts that without the power of coal, oil, and natural gas, we wouldn't have many of the advances we take for granted today. It was the energy from coal that powered the steam engines and factories of the Industrial Revolution, marking a historic shift from agrarian societies to industrialized ones. This energy source allowed for significant increases in productivity, which, in turn, drove economic growth and improved living standards. Short-form note. Not all experts agree with Ridley's assertion that the Industrial Revolution and the fossil fuels that powered it raised living standards. One way experts have measured historical living standards is through biological indicators like average height. This is because average height in a population can reflect nutritional status, health, and living conditions. As a general rule, taller average height indicates good health and high living standards. But during the Industrial Revolution, experts have found that the height of English soldiers declined, hinting at worsening living conditions. Perhaps even more telling, research found that life expectancy in mid-19th century Liverpool fell by 25 years. Foreign aid can't fix developing nations. In discussing the problems developing nations face, Ridley focuses on Africa, where today's extreme poverty is disproportionately concentrated, where he argues that foreign aid may not only be ineffective but could potentially make existing issues worse. According to Ridley, Africa's challenges are deep-rooted and systemic. Corruption, political instability, lack of infrastructure, weak rule of law, and internal conflicts are just some of the issues faced by many African nations. These complex problems won't be solved by infusing money into the continent. Ridley contends that large influxes of foreign aid can inadvertently make these problems worse. Aid money often falls into the hands of corrupt leaders and officials, failing to reach the people it's meant to help. The abundance of free money with little accountability can undermine incentives for good governance and transparency and instead further entrench a cycle of corruption. Consider the case of Haiti, which has received substantial amounts of foreign aid, especially following the devastating earthquake in 2010. Despite intentions to rebuild and develop Haiti, large portions of aid have repeatedly been mismanaged. This influx of aid with inadequate oversight provided a ripe environment for corruption. It created few incentives for local leaders to establish good governance or transparency, as they knew they could rely on continuous external financial support. With corruption deepening and development stalling, the aid intended to help Haiti recover instead contributed to a cycle of dependency and governance issues, hampering long-term sustainable growth. In defense of foreign aid. Contrary to Ridley, some experts have made a robust case for foreign aid. Although opponents of foreign aid claim that the money given to recipient governments ends up being funneled to corrupt and authoritarian leaders, advocates note that only a small portion of U.S. foreign aid goes directly to governments. Most funds are distributed through nonprofits, multilateral organizations, and private entities to ensure accountability and avoid corruption. Further, U.S. foreign aid programs, which are audited regularly, have contributed to significant global improvements, including reductions in extreme poverty, which fell from 36% of the world population in 1990 to 10% in 2015, disease eradication, and increased life expectancy. Finally, advocates argue that foreign aid isn't wasteful or a simple act of charity. It vitally serves U.S. interests by enhancing national security by supporting and stabilizing regional allies, reflecting humanitarian values, and fostering economic development in recipient countries. This can then create markets that benefit the U.S. economically. Free trade is a better path to prosperity. Ridley argues that free trade is the primary engine of development for developing countries. Ridley reasons that when countries freely exchange goods, services, and ideas, they promote competition, leading to better quality goods and services at lower prices. Trade also provides access to a wider range of products and technologies that might not be available locally. Lastly, as we've explored in Part 1, it encourages specialization, fostering economic efficiency and innovation. For example, consider South Korea's transformation from a war-ravaged country in the 1950s to one of the world's leading economies today. Initially, South Korea received significant amounts of foreign aid. However, when South Korea embraced policies that favored economic liberalization and free trade in the 1960s and 1970s, these policies led to rapid industrial growth. They created millions of jobs and substantially raised the standard of living. The increase in local production and exports fostered economic resilience and significantly reduced the country's reliance on foreign aid. The shock doctrine and the perils of free trade. Contrary to Ridley's advocacy of free trade as the best vehicle for economic growth, some writers have noted that imposing free trade can have detrimental, and even catastrophic, effects. In the shock doctrine, Naomi Klein studies the history of economic shock therapy, which is a method of, supposedly, boosting a country's economy through rapid deregulation, privatization, and severe cuts to government spending. In other words, it imposes strict free market policies on the country in question as quickly as possible. However, Klein argues that this economic plan doesn't improve an economy. Instead, economic shock therapy invariably leads to mass unemployment, increased poverty, and widespread starvation, while a few select people become extremely rich. She calls the impact of shock therapy the disaster capitalism complex, a privatized system of destruction and reconstruction that funnels billions of dollars into corporate pockets.